Thanks everyone for showing up. Let me quickly introduce myself. My name is Toni. I work as a researcher at the Ethereum Foundation. And today I want to dive a little deeper into the PBS stack and especially focusing on censorship within the PBS stack. Just to give you a very quick outline what I'm going to talk about, I will start with very shortly explaining what type of censorship I'm meaning when I talk about censorship. Then we will look into the PBS stack, so relays, builders, validators. And finally, I want to quickly cover, in my opinion, quite interesting example, which will involve a comparison of Bitcoin and Ethereum. So if you ask ChatGPT, you get this very, very general definition of what censorship is. So it says like censorship is the suppression and restriction of speech, communication, other information, and so on. But of course, this is much too broad for our context. And indeed, I want to mainly focus on the beacon chain. So every type of censorship we can see on the beacon chain, which will also be part of this talk now. So let's get into it. The first type of censorship is not proposing blocks with transactions to or from targeted entities. And with meaning transactions, I'm of course also speaking of internal transactions, so it's not only the normal transactions that I'm talking about, but more or less every call to any address that can be censored in this case. Next, a much harsher form of censorship would be not attesting to blocks with transactions that interact with a certain entity. And finally, a very harsh form of censorship would be even reorging out certain blocks or excluding them, ignoring them, if they contain a transaction of a certain entity. And if we think about censoring, right, we also have to answer the question, what is censoring? First, of course, if you don't like your neighbor, you can censor him, which would already be censorship. But in the Ethereum context, when we talk about censorship, we are mainly talking about OFAC, right? But surprisingly, OFAC is actually not the only list existing, right? There are other countries that also have their enemies. And here on this slide, you can see some countries with their own sanction lists. And although we only talk about OFAC all the time, there are actually all the countries have their own lists. And the OFAC list is therefore so dominant because it was the first that really first included some Bitcoin addresses and then later on also targeted some Ethereum addresses like Tornado Cash. So for my talk, I will also mainly focus on the OFAC list just because the OFAC list is the only one that that has a real impact on today's Ethereum landscape. To quickly tell you something about the methodology I use, so how do I even know that a certain entity is censoring or not, right? This is not that straightforward, but there are actually a bunch of cool ways how you can determine is a certain entity censoring or not. And one cool way is just using a binomial distribution. So we assume that the probability of a block containing a certain transaction, so containing OFAC sanctioned content, is binomial distributed. And by doing so, we can just calculate what is the probability, the likelihood of a certain entity proposing a certain number of blocks without any OFAC sanctioned content. P here is the probability of a block containing OFAC sanctioned transactions. This means 2%, so 2.18% of all blocks since the merge contained OFAC sanctioned content. And now it's basically very simple. The larger the sample size, the more sure we can be that a certain entity is censoring. So for example, if you propose 10 blocks, then it's not that easy to tell if you're censoring or not, right? This would not be very accurate. But if you propose 1,000 blocks and there was no OFAC sanctioned content in your block, then we can be quite sure that you might be censoring the chain. So this just as a starter, and now we can dive into the actual censorship of the current network. So starting with the validators. If we look at the validators, it looks actually quite good, you might say. So the graph shows you the distribution, so the share of slots, and we can see around 15% of all slots as of today are produced by censoring validators. And now you might ask, who are these validators? Basically, you can go to tornado.pix, and there you can see which entities are including Tornado Cash transactions and which are not. And in the first 4 columns, you can see the number of blocks of those entities, the number of blocks with sanctioned content. And then let's focus on the last column. It tells you the percentage of OFAC blocks of a certain entity. And I want to highlight especially those entities. So let's look into them. Figment is the first entity, which has a very low OFAC inclusion rate, right? So we can see around 0.32% of all Figment blocks contain OFAC sanctioned content. If you compare it to Lido, which has 1.78, it's much lower, right? Now you might say, okay, why is it still above 0? But we will talk about that later. Then Kraken, right? So if you look at Kraken, it looks like they started censoring very recently, right? So you can see also Kraken has a very low of OFAC inclusion, same as other validators like Celsius and some smaller ones like Staker, Bitstamp, Qcoin, Bitfinex, Everstakepool, BitPie, or CryptoStake.com. All of those entities have a very low inclusion of OFAC sanctioned content, which might point to them censoring. Next up, we have relays, right? Relays were a big topic, especially around the merge. The whole Math Boost ecosystem was launched in parallel to the merge, more or less, and it started with mainly Flashbots being the only very dominant relay. So we can see that at the beginning of the year, we had almost 80% of all relayed blocks being censored. This was just because the Flashbots relay was so dominant and almost all the blocks were relayed by Flashbots. This meant that around 80% of all blocks relayed were in the end censored by those entities. Then, over time, we saw many other relays coming up, like Ultrasound Relay, Agnostic Gnosis Relay, the Iaestos Relay, also Blockstart. There's a Blockstart relay that is non-censoring, and the situation improved quite dramatically. If we look into the numbers, we can see the same picture that we saw that I just explained. So we can see that Flashbots, Blocknative, Eden, they are all censoring, right? So they are on the very top, on the very bottom of this table. On the very top, you can see the non-censoring relays. And something that is quite interesting, for example, let's focus on Bloxroute Regulated. Bloxroute Regulated is also a censoring relay, but you can see there was a block in the last 24 hours, right? So in the last 24 hours, of course, mistakes happen, and from time to time, some OFAC transactions just slip through, right? And we have all seen all these security checks at our hotel and stuff, and you know that this OFAC block might have, so it felt very similar for him, right? So it was not that sophisticated. So the check was not that sophisticated, and from time to time, even the non-censoring relays relay censored blocks or to-be censored blocks. And in order to do censoring properly, you would really have to simulate that transaction, right? It's not enough to just check where the transaction comes from or what's the first contact, so which contract is touched first. You really have to look into the state and see, does a certain transaction touch the state of a certain sanctioned entity, and only then you can be sure that I have to censor it or not. Next up, we have the builders. And the builder landscape looks very, very scary, right? At the beginning, it was quite good. Builders were non-censoring, but over time, many of the builders, felt the pressure of OFAC, and now we are around 80% of censoring builders. This means even if you connect to a non-censoring relay, the probability that you get a censor blocks are extremely high. And more or less, as a validator, you can do nothing about that. You can connect exclusively to non-censoring relays, but it won't help you because the builders are censoring. Again, let's look at the table, and we can especially focusing on the top builders here. So we can see our Sync builder, Beaver build, Flashbots, Builder 69, Gambit Labs, and so on. Those are all censoring builders, right? And it's not like they were censoring since the merge, but many of them started very recently. On the other side of the spectrum, we can also see builders like Payload.de or Manifold that have a very, very large Tornado Cash inclusion rate. So for example, for Manifold, it's almost every second block includes a Tornado Cash transaction. And for Payload.de, it's also at 28%. So we can see both sides of that. So some are censoring very good, and some are really trying, probably really searching for Tornado Cash transactions to make sure they get included very quickly. Finally, I want to quickly cover a topic that is quite old. Maybe to ask the audience, who has ever heard of a feather fork? It's from Bitcoin, very old concept. Okay, one hand. Nice, then let me explain you what a feather fork is. Feather fork is it was first proposed in the Bitcoin Talk Forum by Andrew Miller in 2013. And what a feather fork is, it's like, how can I censor the whole network with having less than 50% of the hash rate? And how this works, it's actually quite simple. Let's assume we have two entities, right? We have Alice and Bob. And Alice doesn't like Bob, so she will not build on top of blocks that contain a transaction of Bob. Very simple. Importantly, Alice announces that publicly. So everyone knows that Alice, with her 20% hash rate, she will not build on any block that contains a transaction of Bob. This also means Alice will reorg blocks out if they contain a transaction of Bob. Next, we know, because Alice has a hash rate of 20%, right? We know that the probability of having two consecutive slots is around 4%, right? Because of Alice controls a hash rate of 20% and 0.2 to the power of 2 is 0.04, so you arrive at the 4%. So now, as a miner, you might think, okay, if I propose a block that contains a transaction of Bob, then there is a 4% chance that Alice will reorg me out, because the 4%, so she can build two blocks and then has the longest chain. So for all miners, this creates an incentive to also censor Bob, just to make sure that they will not be reorged by the 20% hash rate of Alice. And now, what about feather forking on Ethereum, right? What happens if some big stakers announce that they want to reorg out every block that contains OFAC sanctioned content? Currently, you need 5 entities to get up to over 50% of the total stake. So if you have Lido, Stakefish, Coinbase, Kraken, and Figment, for example, saying that they will reorg out blocks that contain OFAC sanctioned content, we are already above 30% of the stake. And this would then mean, so we assume the strongest form of censorship, they will reorg it out and announce that publicly, and the result would be that economically rational validators would also have to censor just to make sure that they will not be reorged out. The cool thing is, if we compare Bitcoin to Ethereum in this situation, for Bitcoin, you can do that with below 50% of the total hash rate. For Ethereum, you need at least 51% in order to win the fork choice. Finally, this brings me to a very important topic, because we have not seen such a harsh form of censorship yet, right? So there were no entities, at least as of my knowledge, that were really trying to reorg out OFAC sanctioned content from the chain. But if that would happen, we would still have social slashing, right? So if that would happen, we could still, in contrast to Bitcoin, counter that by social slashing those entities, taking their stake away if they try to attack the chain through censorship. And this is basically all I have. Here you can find some more dashboards and stuff, especially tornado.pix and censorship.pix, some open source data if you want to experiment and look into the math boost stuff yourself. And yeah, you can find my contacts, and I'm happy to answer any questions if there are any.